The episode titled The Apple premiered in Season 2. It was written by Max Erhlich and directed by Joseph Pevney. It was Episode 5 and first aired on October 12, 1967. This episode would be the first time that we hear Mr. Chekov's first name, revealed as Pavel. Yeoman Landon would affectionately refer to him as Pav. Keith Andes would play the role of AKUTA. Bill Blackburn would play the role of Lieutenant Hadley. He would also portray one of the natives as well. An interesting side note is that this episode marks the only time we see such a large landing party that had more than 6 people involved. This episode also touches on the subject of the USS Enterprise being able to separate from the nacelles and the primary hull. In the original script, the USS Enterprise would ultimately destroy Vaal. The large stone head with the horn would be exploded. However, it was decided that the ship's phasers would ultimately disable Vaal without exploding the prop that was made of paper mache and the result of many hours of work by the props department. On Stardate 3715.3, the Enterprise would be sent to examine planet Gamma Trianguli 6. Upon landing, Captain Kirk and the landing party would be struck at the beauty of the planet. Upon leading the investigation to a nearby village, a strange flower would turn and fire projectiles into one of the crewmen. He would be pronounced dead by Dr. McCoy. Mr. Scott would inform the captain that the potency of the ship's antimatter pods were being affected by something, possibly the electromagnetic field of the planet, but really wasn't sure, but they were looking into it. Mr. Spock would also register strong subsurface vibrations coming from the planet in all directions. He would also inform the captain that they were being artificially produced. The landing party would become aware that there was a life form moving around them with remarkable agility. While walking towards the village, Mr. Spock would make an observation of a rock, commenting on its weight and composition. He would easily break it in 2 pieces and then throw half away, and upon hitting the ground, the half he threw would explode. Captain Kirk would say, "Would you mind where you throw your rocks, Mr. Spock?" Mr. Spock would comment on the instability of the makeup of the substances of the surface of the planet. Mr. Scott would later inform Captain Kirk that the matter-antimatter pods were completely inert. He would go on to say that it was interference that was coming from the surface of the planet. Captain Kirk said that they were heading in that direction, and they would keep him advised. Dr. McCoy would make an observation that the projectiles that came from the flower were highly poisonous. At that moment, another flower turned its sights on Captain Kirk. Sensing this, Mr. Spock would push him out of the way and bear the brunt of the projectiles and collapse. Dr. McCoy would inform the captain that he needed to get Mr. Spock back to the Enterprise. Having had enough, Captain Kirk would beam the landing party back up. He would contact Mr. Scott and order them to beam up the landing party. The Enterprise would be unable to comply as the transporter would be inhibited and unable to establish contact with the landing party. Mr. Scott would then go on to say that the Enterprise could not beam up or fly. Captain Kirk would ask if it was the same interference that was causing the problems with the matter-antimatter pods. Mr. Scott said he was unsure. He would check into it and get back to him. Mr. Spock would then awaken, and with the exception of an upset stomach, while was the case with Dr. McCoy's potions, he would feel fine. Suddenly, the sky would blacken and there would be lightning strikes. The crewmen would be struck by lightning and disintegrated. As soon as the sky blackened, it would clear after the attack. Crewman Mallory would contact Captain Kirk and inform him that he found the village. Radio interference caused Kirk to become worried about him, so they all raced towards his position. Mallory began to race back towards the landing party, but he would trip while running on a path over the same kind of rock Mr. Spock had deemed unstable. Upon tripping, he would explode, blowing himself to pieces and being killed. Mr. Spock would later inform Captain Kirk that the presence would be back. Kirk ordered Mr. Chekov and Mr. Spock to create a diversion as they would surround him. Upon making contact with the life form, Captain Kirk would strike him. He would be taken back and noticed that the humanoid, later to be known as AKUTA, who was the leader of the Veeders of Vaal, began to cry. He would simply state, You struck me with your hand. He would later inform Captain Kirk that he was the eyes and ears of Vaal. When Kirk asked who Vaal was, AKUTA said, "Vaal is Vaal. Vaal is everything." Mr. Spock would make the observation that AKUTA had antennae coming out the back of his head just behind each ear. AKUTA said that they were given to him in the dim time so he could relay Vaal's wishes to the villagers. Mr. Scott would later inform Captain Kirk that a tractor beam from the surface had captured the Enterprise. With the warp drive still out, they only had impulse engines to try to break free. He informed Captain Kirk that the Enterprise had only about 16 hours of energy to fight the tractor beam before burning up in the atmosphere. AKUTA would bring Captain Kirk and a landing party to meet Vaal. Mr. Spock would inform the captain that it was high workmanship and very ancient. It also had immense power, but it was not the source of the power coming from the planet, but rather Vaal was an access point to the power beneath the planet's surface. Mr. Spock would then find out the hard way that Vaal had a 30-foot radius force field surrounding it. AKUTA informed Captain Kirk that Vaal was sleeping and would soon wake to be fed. AKUTA would then welcome the landing party to his village. He offered them refreshments and a place to rest. He informed the villagers to welcome them and accept them as friends. Captain Kirk would inquire as to the children. AKUTA would refer to them as replacements, and he said that none were needed. Upon inquiring about love, AKUTA would say that the touching was forbidden by Vaal. That is when Dr. McCoy would go on to say, "Well, there goes paradise." Mr. Scott said that there was no change. Kirk would inform him to place everything into the impulse engines. Captain Kirk said to jettison the nacelles and warp drive and get the main section out if necessary, but to use his imagination. Mr. Scott informed the captain that he had a plan to divert everything with the kitchen sink, short of life support, into the impulse engines to break free. That would be just as dangerous. Dr. McCoy would later inform the captain that the villagers were in perfect health and had not aged, and that certain harmful elements that were being filtered out by the sun were not affecting them. That is when they heard a signal coming from outside. That is when they saw the villagers heading towards Vaal. Kirk and Spock would follow and observe AKUTA watching as the villagers threw items into the throat of Vaal. Upon inspection, Mr. Spock confirmed that there was no living being there and that Vaal was indeed a machine. Dr. McCoy would soon join them and state that the human had a right to develop into a society of their own choosing. This society had become stagnant, and its only purpose was to service a machine. Mr. Scott would later inform the captain that there was indeed a power drop that corresponded to when a signal was given to feed Vaal. He also informed the captain that he needed another 8 hours to try to break free. It was cutting it close, but he stated that in the event that it didn't work, he would rather not have to wait too long before the end. Later on, when we see AKUTA, he is speaking to Vaal and receiving instructions. It would be later known to us that Vaal had instructed AKUTA to kill the strangers. He would gather the village men and the landing party was asleep and show them a melon. He then picked up a heavy branch and smashed it and said it is an easy thing to do, and that Vaal demanded them to do it. The next morning, sensing something was wrong, Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock would try to make communications with Vaal. The response would be the clouds gathering and lightning that would strike Mr. Spock in the back. Upon returning to the village, Dr. McCoy would tend Mr. Spock. The villagers would then attempt to attack the landing party, as instructed by Vaal. However, they would be unsuccessful, and Captain Kirk would order them into the huts. Mr. Scott would inform the captain that they were attempting to break free, and upon doing so, they were able to break free a bit and gain another hour only, but had blown out every system in the process, and he informed the captain that they had nothing left to try again. Shortly after that, the signal from Vaal to be fed sounded again. This time, Captain Kirk would prevent the villagers from feeding Vaal. He would then order Mr. Scott to fire phasers at the surface location where the force field had been, and to maintain firing until told to stop. Unable to sustain the force field or draw power from other sources, Vaal would drop the tractor beam as well as the force field. Mr. Spock would indicate that all power levels were zero and that Vaal was dead after Captain Kirk ceased fire. Captain Kirk explained to AKUTA that they would be able to grow on their own and as a society, and that everything they produced was theirs to keep and that they would like it. He also said that they would like love a lot as well. Back on the Enterprise, Mr. Spock had mentioned the interference of the villagers and likened it to being thrown out of Eden. Captain Kirk asked, "Are you saying that I am in the role of Satan? Do we even have any crew members that even remotely resemble Satan?" Him and Dr. McCoy stopped and looked at Mr. Spock. Mr. Spock crossed his arms and said that he was unaware of anyone that fit that description.